Yo, what's going on, Titan Clan? It is your boy King Titan X here, back with another video, and you guys already know what's the deal about this one. As you guys already know, like, Neptune did help with this movie, and yeah, and they're basically working on their own project. If you guys are interested in becoming a co-writer or helping her edit the story that she is making, like, it's basically a crossover between Date Alive and DXD. So if you guys are interested, just be sure to check out the channel, DM her on, well, Discord. If you guys are already in my Discord, you guys can probably just ping her or something, and she's pretty active in my Discord server. So yeah, I will leave the link to her channel, my Discord server, and yeah, let's just get on with the video. Roll that intro.
何としてでも勝つ。何としてでも生きる。
Now, unlike most stories, we would not necessarily start at the very beginning. Instead, we start the story off with Azuku, Todoroki, and Ida. They were in the middle of fighting the hero killer Stain. Azuku, throughout the fight, would realize that this was a losing battle. They were getting pushed back by Stain, even though they had the advantage in numbers. Azuku would tell the other two to run and get help. Ida would want to argue though, but Azuku would shut him up immediately. After Todoroki and Ida ran to get help, Azuku would immediately start to get outpaced by the hero killer. It didn't take too long before Azuku was left bleeding out by the time the heroes had arrived. The hero killer Stain had managed to defeat Azuku, injure him brutally, and even put him down to where he was knocking on death's door. By the time the heroes had arrived, it was already too late. A funeral was held for Azuku the next day. Many people would have mourned his death, but all for one would have found out about the death of All Might's successor thanks to one of the spies he had within the police force. He was well aware of the fact this was All Might's successor from the get-go. As soon as he had found out, well, as soon as the sports festival had started, he had witnessed how this boy acted. He was able to tell that this was the newest successor to One for All. Even his story was a bit sketchy to begin with, awakening your quirk at the age of, 14, 15? And it's this strong. You have so little control, but your quirk is so immensely strong that it can hurt your body. How interesting. And then you also name it Superpowered. Well, isn't that just a creative name? And this kid was apparently always an idol. Well, he always saw All Might as an idol to the point where he even had a whole costume designed after him. That it pretty much just wrote itself, really. All Might couldn't have ended up picking a more obvious successor. So All For One decided, you know what? Let's decide to torture this man a little bit more. All For One would have basically taken Azuku's body. He would have retrieved the boy's body and begin to experiment on it. Throughout this process, All For One would have and started to reanimate Izuku. This would have been considered a forbidden form of science, but they were long gone by the time they had started making Nomus. And they had also made, well, Kuroguri, a more sentient sort of Nomu. Overall, they had no morals at this point. They did not necessarily care for experimenting with human life any longer. They just saw it as a way to pursue their goals in order to just keep moving forward. This was just a natural process in their eyes. All for one have modified Izuku's body to where it was almost entirely cybernetic. Izuku's quake, one for all, would have been used as a sort of battery as well. Izuku's memories would have been warped all throughout this process. The fight against Stain, Izuku would have been meant to believe that, well, Todoroki and Ida actually abandoned him that night, as soon as he found the right time to do so, never bothering to even think about coming back for him. Even when it came onto it, to his experience at UA, that would have also been warped. Izuku would have been brainwashed to believe that everyone seemingly hated him, treating him poorly all throughout his time at UA. The ones Izuku now hated the most were All Might and Bakugo. All for One especially made it so that he hated All Might. But when it came on to Bakugo, he didn't really have to actually do much. Just looking back at the boy's history with the blonde brat. And Bakugo was already horrible to Izuku from the get-go. And All for One really questioned why he would consider somebody like Bakugo a friend. It all really, honestly, all for One really needed to do was just exaggerate the amount of pain Izuku had to go through with Bakugo just a teensy bit more. Just enough to where Izuku would be completely justified in hating Bakugo. When it came on to All Might, All for One would change it to where the symbol of peace seemingly defended the explosion brat's actions. He would even show regret towards making Izuku his successor, and especially the hypocrisy of when All Might told Izuku he could not be a hero. How ironic that the one person who would tell Izuku that he could not be a hero because he was quirkless was, well, quirkless himself at one point. The only reason he was the #1 hero in the first place was because of borrowed power, and he never even made it seem like, oh, this is the truth either. He would lie to the public, making them falsely believe that this quirk was all his own, rather than it just being the collective power of others that managed to get him to his position in society. Even the 10 months of training were altered, so Izuku would believe from there on that the man emotionally broke him by throwing trash and slurs at him each and every time he had a chance. All of this would show how pathetic Izuku seemingly was back then, but All for One, he was the one giving him a second chance at life. A chance to get revenge for all the atrocities done to him because he was too weak, too pathetic. All because life had decided to give him a bad hand. Izuku would adopt a new outlook on life, that being justice needed to be served by his own hands. All for One had no issue with Izuku's mindset at all. He even added a couple of extra quirks into this new no move and sent him to attack UA. The class would have been in the mountains with the wild pussycats at this time. most had ended up passing their exams, but well, there were a couple who did not necessarily pass, so they would be with Aizawa. Those who did pass were able to have a bit of fun for once after all this training they did. At this point in time, Tsuyu and Ochako, they would have been together as a team in order to play some sort of game with Class 1B, this being to lighten the mood after such a hard day of training. They are preparing to steel their nerves against some of the 1B students, but someone else appeared in their place. It was what looked like a robot in polished black armor, and he had green outlines. There was even a weird symbol on his chest, red with an A in the middle. They did not necessarily know what it meant though. The robot's eyes were glowing red too. The robot was rather intimidating. Before Ochako knew it, Tsuyu's heart was ripped out straight from her chest. The robot would look over to Ochako before stating that they would get revenge for all the atrocities she had done to him. Ochako would have been confused until she began to hear the stories that this robot was speaking of. Only one other person would have had these sort of memories, and even then when it came on to these sort of experiences, she would have noticed that they had been tainted far worse than she remembered how they were. She would connect the dots rather quickly and realize that these were all twisted versions of her memories with Izuku. There was no way though. Izuku was dead. How could this be possible? Unless somebody decided to tamper with Izuku's dead body. And if so, who? Who had the audacity to do such a thing? Had they no shame? But she wouldn't be taken out of her thoughts immediately, because Izuku would begin to start shooting lasers at her. She would get injured in the process. She would try to flee the scene, realizing that she could not get close to him and use her quirk against him, or even try to bring some sense back to him either. It would have been too much of a risk to attempt such a thing. She had learned to not be too reckless ever since, well, the USJ and her fight against Bakugo. It really taught her about how the world is set up. She wouldn't have been aware of the fact though that Izuku, he still had his quirk. He still had one for all though, and now he knew how to use it better than ever. He didn't even have the limitations that his old body had before. His old body was too weak at the time to handle the full power of the quirk, but it had been enhanced significantly by these cybernetic plates. Izuku would forcefully access Black Whip and grab Ochako's head, twisting it around 180 degrees, snapping her neck. Dabi would have witnessed everything and be impressed with how brutal Izuku could be. Twice would have been a bit scared though, and at the same time his other personality would have appeared, saying that it was quite amazing to witness Izuku's brutality. Toga would have been gushing all over this. More students would be killed all throughout their time at the camp. Kota would die to muscular, and the man would go on to wreak even more havoc all throughout the mountains. He would be put down by Aizawa temporarily. He would have erased the man's quake, but Izuku would come in, using a powerful enough blast to completely erase Aizawa's head. all of Izuku's former classmates would be killed at the hands of either the Vanguard squad or Izuku himself, no longer having any compassion for any of them. Class 1B wouldn't be fortunate enough to escape either, having to face the likes of Muscular and Moonfish, with Izuku shape-shifting his arms and legs into that of different creatures and weapons that were too much for even the strongest of Class 1B to handle. The only one to survive would end up being Bakugo, and they would have taken him as well. After the tragedy, UA would be shut down permanently, since they had several heroes there to protect the students, but the worst case scenario still managed to happen. UA was under so much scrutiny afterwards. Even after it was shut down, people were still knocking on these heroes' doors, sending angry mail to these former hero teachers, saying that they should have done better. They should have been there to stop these villains. What kind of heroes were they? All Might would be livid and upset with himself, believing that the tides of the battle could have changed significantly if he was only there. If only he didn't have his time limit. If only he wasn't so weak now. All Might would eventually be lured out to All For One's hideout though. Once he had found out that, well, there was a chance Bakugo was still alive. After all, they were able to account for the fact that almost everybody's bodies were at the mountain, but they were missing one student. It was Bakugo. So All Might immediately began to think that there was a chance Bakugo was still alive. He would have set up a whole rescue squad for Bakugo, and if it turned out that he wasn't alive, after all, at the very least, he would be able to put down All For One, with all the rest of the heroes being there to put an end to All For One's operations. The group of heroes that were ready to rescue Bakugo would almost immediately be killed off though by Izuku's enhanced energy beam quirk. They had even found what was seemingly a battered and bruised Bakugo. He was knocking on death's door. Izuku just decided to roll up right behind Bakugo. All Might would be the only one remaining afterwards. Bakugo would be laughing as well before he began to melt, revealing the fact that this wasn't even the real Bakugo, but this was Toga. Izuku would show All Might the head of Bakugo, with his spine still attached, before throwing it at the hero. All Might would be in a state of shock, but Izuku would use this moment in order to rush at the hero he used to admire, before kicking him in the face, throwing him back several feet. All Might would be dazed from the attack, not expecting that amount of force from anyone besides All For One. Izuku would begin to talk about how horrible of a hero All Might was, and the memories Izuku talked about, and it caused All Might to realize something sickening. The beach, the 10 months of training at the beach, how All Might told Izuku he could never be a hero because of the fact that he was quirkless, and then started making up some news stories talking about how he seemingly always defended Bakugo's actions, saying that he regretted making Izuku his successor, and if he could, he would have probably made Bakugo into his successor instead. But look what happened to them now. Looks like Bakugo can't be his new successor anymore, especially now that Izuku still has a quirk, and he no longer has the limitations. He's no longer weak. Well, is he now a worthy successor to One For All? Huh? Is he now strong? Is he strong enough for All Might? Is he strong enough to be accepted by All Might? That's what Izuku was asking him, losing his temper. All for One would appear as well, clapping and applauding the fact even an idiot like All Might was able to figure it out, judging by the expression on his face. He would also reveal the fact, though, that Shigaraki was actually the grandson of Nana Shimaru. What the heck? Nana Shimura. Nana Shimura. You know what? Forget her name. I can never pronounce the last name for some reason. Anyways, causing the man to become extremely distraught. Izuku would overwhelm All Might with the full force of One for All, and even using All Might's master's quirk, Float, in order to reach high into the sky and drop down, crushing the blonde's chest and puncturing his height. All of this would have been caught on the news, and All for One would laugh, knowing that fear was now in everyone's heights. Within a matter of weeks, All for One would begin to spread his influence. Shigaraki and his team would be sent to deal with the Yakuza. Shigaraki managed to become a bit jealous of Izuku, seeing that All for One had began to favor the Cyborg over him. He was just a new recruit, and then he suddenly became All for One's favorite. It made no sense to Shigaraki. He would attempt to get back in favor with All for One by attempting to have the Yakuza merge into the League of Villains, considering how much more influence they had here. After all, look at the streets. They're littered with villains all over, causing all sorts of tragedies to happen. They're literally robbing stores. They're literally killing people left and right. People are fearful of whether they can even walk out the door now without having to face a villain. And all of this was started from just a couple of weeks ago, after All for One stunt with All Might. After what ended up happening to All Might, after literally seeing the symbol of peace die right before Japan's eyes, caught on live broadcast, they literally had to turn off the broadcast as soon as they had realized that All Might had been defeated. They tried to change it to another station or something, but this was all over the news. No matter how many people tried to cover it up, it was impossible at this point. And now Shigaraki was trying to give Chisaki a chance to join the new regime, try and join his legion, but Chisaki was having none of it. He would refuse. Chisaki would only be interested in All for One and the cyborg that killed All Might after all. In his point of view, the League of Villains was only keeping their name afloat in today's society because of those two, not because of what Shigaraki was capable of doing, or what the rest of the League of Villains were capable of doing either. He found that these were the only relevant ones, Izuku and All for One. Everyone else, well, in all honesty, they should have been joining his regime. After all, at least he had a plan. He had a plan for how to take over Japan. Chisaki would go on to kill Magni and get rid of one of Mr. Compressor's arms, effectively declaring war against All for One. And he would have never realized he had made the biggest mistake ever at that point. He would soon regret this though. Light Eye would attempt to still maintain some order and assemble a hero team in order to bring down the Yakuza. They would make it through quite a bit of the Yakuza until they were they were forced to face off against Sasaki and the 8 bullets. It would be a struggle for the heroes, but they would get through most of the bullets. Mirio would arrive and begin to fight off Sasaki, even when he lost his quake. Sasaki would be attacked relentlessly by Mirio until the older gentleman managed to grab onto Mirio with one of his bare hands. He was bleeding. He was breathing heavily too. He was not used to this sort of pain. He was used to just getting his way most of the time. It didn't make much sense to Sasaki, but now he was going to finally settle this. Right when he was about to obliterate Mirio though, he instead got knocked out by Izuku. Izuku shot through Mirio's height and grabbed Eri as well. Kirigiri would open up a portal for Izuku not too long later, and Izuku would go back to the base with the 2 most important people at the time. Sasaki would be wide awake, chained down and unable to use his quake due to quake dampening drugs. Shigaraki would decay his arms while All For One would take over Hulk's quake. He had never endured so much pain before, and having his quake taken away from him, it was a new experience for him. He wasn't expecting for something like this to ever happen to him. All For One would plan on raising up the girl, Eri, in order to harness her quite better and be absolutely subservient to him. Izuku would go under some more modifications. He would become stronger, but at the same time more subservient to only All For One, suppressing the vestiges of One For All as much as possible. Now, All For One had realized for a while now that Izuku would have some sporadic moments, having some times where he would question All For One, and All For One would realize that, well, this was the doing of One For All, trying to fight against All For One's control. They were trying the best they could, but All For One was making sure that Izuku would never break free of his control. He had invested too much into Izuku at this point to lose him now. When it came on to Shigaraki, he would deal with Redestro's army while Izuku was going through modifications. He would manage to finally show his worth after all the years All For One invested towards the boy. And when it came on to Twice as well, like the many new developments within Shigaraki's group, it honestly impressed All For One. He was really finally getting to see what he genuinely wanted to see from Shigaraki from day one. He always knew that Shigaraki had potential to become one of the greatest villains within Japan, and now he was finally letting that potential be released. Finally, he had stopped holding himself back for so long. He was finally free. He was finally exactly what All For One wanted. And now with that, he will also be planning to take over the boy's body. Shigaraki would end up becoming his new host. The process wouldn't be fully complete. Though. Although All For One was trying to have it to where Shigaraki would inherit All For One, the quake, through several modifications, several experimentations done by Dr. Ujiko, and a constant monitoring of his progress. Right when he was reaching closer and closer to 100% assimilation, the heroes would have attacked. They would have messed up the process. And although the process wouldn't necessarily be fully complete though, the remaining heroes would begin to realize they had made a big mistake when trying to actually fight All For One and his forces. Shigaraki was able to wipe out most of the hero alliance within just one touch, destroying what seemed like a whole city block in just one fell swoop, killing several heroes, killing several civilians. So many people had to die, but nobody really cared at that moment. None of the villains anyway, because they were still with Shigaraki and All For One. Azuku would be one of the captains for All For One, slaughtering several heroes as they had basically declared war against all of Japan now. Japan would have been conquered in just a couple of days by the villains by the time they had finally ended the war. They had no All Might, they had no Night Eye, they had barely any forces at this point. There was barely anybody on the hero side to really do much of anything against such strong forces that were allied with All For One. This would have basically ended up becoming what was known as the villain's country. Star and Stripes would seek revenge for All Might, wanting to destroy that mechanical monster who set up the domino effect for Japan's current state. But there was one issue. She didn't know what his real name was, making her quite ineffective against Izuku. She had to be more tactical against Izuku, but he would end up being too fast and strong for her. He would knock her out in one fell swoop and destroy the jets that were attacking him. The only reason he didn't kill her immediately was because of the fact that All For One wanted it quick. He would bring her back to All For One so that he could do exactly that, extract her quick. And from there was no one that could stop All For One. He would bring society to its knees. Society would crumble before them, and All For One would build it back up in his image. All For One would have completely taken over Shigaraki's body and raise up Eri to where she would constantly keep him in his prime, which is basically like 20s to 30s. And Izuku, well, he would bring justice to the world and begin to create tech that would serve as his extra eyes. He would make duplicates of himself actually, and his influence would begin to spread all throughout the world, with him being constantly aware of everything. He would continue to become stronger, becoming a nigh unstoppable monster. With the help of Twice, he was even able to create more duplicates of himself, more duplicates, more people ended up being converted into what you could say cyborgs. All For One would have realized that Izuku would probably do well with one of those sort of quirks that could allow him to duplicate himself and constantly be aware. He would set that up, and well, that was basically the end, because Izuku would be running the streets from there on. He would eventually assimilate himself with the many pieces of technology until he was what made up most of the world's tech, further cementing All For One's rule and true justice. This would be the end. Izuku ended up becoming technology itself. He would have set it up to where clones of himself would be patrolling the streets at all times. And when it came on to All For One, he would just be sipping his wine glass enjoying the new luxuries of life, the new luxuries of our society, ruled through fear, ruled by all for one. It was his ideal society. And that is how we end this What If, people. So yeah, it is your boy King Time Next signing out. You guys already know the deal. If you like the video, well, you may as well like the video. Click that like button. Maybe check out a couple more of my videos. If you're still not convinced that you should subscribe to me, but you like this video though, and if you like those videos as well, why not subscribe to see more of my content? Maybe leave a comment and share the video as well. And yeah, it's your boy King Time Next signing out.